Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. We'll give it one more moment and we will jump into our webinar. Hope you all are having a good day. So it looks like we're slowing down a little bit. Awesome. So let's get started. I want to welcome you all to the April Children's Mental Health Matters webinar series. Today's session is being recorded and will be made available to you all in the coming week. Our speaker today, Brijan Fellows, will explore how early exposure to stress and adversity within the family affects an infant's cognitive, emotional, and physical development. Today's presentation will include the cycle of trauma across generations, epigenetic factors, and the role of early intervention and responsive relationships in breaking that cycle. And so I want to give a very quick intro to our speaker for today. Brijan Fellows is a clinical social worker with expertise in perinatal and infant and early childhood mental health. She is the clinical program director for the Taghi Center for Infant Studies Secure Starts Clinic at UMB. She oversees various grant-funded initiatives, including state and federal projects funded by SAMHSA and the Department of Justice, and she supervises staff and trainees from various disciplines. Brijan has presented early childhood research and clinical findings at numerous local and statewide conferences, and her work primarily focuses on addressing the unique needs of vulnerable infant populations, including refugees and those affected by trauma and substance use. So Brijan, we just want to welcome you to our April webinar series, and you can take it away.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. Good to see you all in this sunny morning, still morning. As Ronnie said, I'm Bree Fellows, and I'm a clinical director at the University of Maryland. I see some familiar names who could probably do this presentation as well as I could. I do have an ambitious slide deck that I hope to get through. Some of this may be familiar to some of you. I'm sure there will be things that I won't necessarily address that you may have questions about. I encourage you to reach out to me with questions or comments or any referrals you might have to, and I'll talk a little bit more about our clinic. I do want to give everyone a heads up that this is a tough topic to talk about. Trauma is challenging. Early childhood, in my opinion, makes it even more challenging. So please take care of yourself. If anything is triggering for you, please do what you need to do to step away. Maybe watch this at another time, as I know it's being recorded. I do have a couple videos. I don't think there's too much triggering, but you never know what might trigger you depending on your own experience as a parent, as a young child, as a consumer of mental health services. So I just like to give that caveat and know that I am thinking about you and hoping that this isn't too triggering, but that it gives you some information and thoughts about how to help these young kids that have been impacted by trauma in our worlds and communities. All right. Okay, so let me get started. I'm going to share my slide, hopefully very successfully. I'm not very good at keeping track of the chat during the presentation, so Ronnie's going to keep me on track with that. Like I said, I have an ambitious deck, so hopefully I'll have a little bit of time afterwards, but don't hesitate to stop me, unmute if you've got something really pressing. Okay. All right. Let's see. The beginning. Slideshow. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. Does this look right to you, Ronnie? Okay, great. Okay, so this is me. So we're going to talk about the impact of family trauma on early childhood development. So I have some objectives to think about. We're going to understand the impact of toxic stress on social emotional development, particularly young children. We're going to learn about the prevalence of trauma in young children and identify common traumatic reactions that occur. And we're going to build resilience, because you cannot do this work or identify these kids unless you take good care of yourself and have your own resilience and ways to take good care of yourself. So the impact of traumatic events, including abuse and neglect, have lasting effects on children's development. And although it is complex to untangle all the mechanisms and interface in the body and brain, we know that research demonstrates consistent findings that executive functioning, adaptive thinking, and emotional processing and regulation are all significantly negatively affected when traumatic events occur. And there's an increased risk for behavior problems, including ADHD, deficits in cognitive functioning, and ultimately poor school performance as a result of this. However, not all children who experience abuse or trauma or neglect have problematic outcomes. But the more adversities, if you think about the ACEs research, if you're familiar with that, adverse childhood events, and the longer they're exposed, the less chance they have to build that resiliency and the greater risk of poor life and health outcomes, except when we have providers like you, family members like you, community members like you to really buffer those effects. And not all of them necessarily need therapy, but they are affected by these complex traumas that they could have faced. And these are some of the impacts that it can have because the brain is developing during this time period. And so again, trauma can derail this development. Memory starts at birth. So babies and young children remember experiences that they've lived through before they can speak about them. It lives in their tissues. It lives in their not necessarily in their verbal memory, but certainly in their sensory memory, and they may not be able to talk about it, but they do experience those things, even if they weren't in the room necessarily, but overhearing things that may have happened to them or been directly something directly happened to them. So young children need their parents' help in learning to express emotions that they're feeling, and to do that without hurting themselves or others. So we talk a lot about, building emotional vocabulary, learning skills to handle big emotions that they have that don't involve aggression, because they don't even necessarily know why they're experiencing these emotions. And we may not either. However, if we keep the trauma lens in mind, then this can help us to help them to thrive and be healthy in their mental health. So this is, a complex sort of way of talking about how stress impacts the brain. So there's a neurobiological reaction to threat. And so when the brain and body sense danger, the amygdala, which is the emotional processing center, sends a signal to the hypothalamus. And when this hypothalamus receives a distress signal, epinephrine is released, right? So all of these things are going on. Breathing, blood pressure, heart rate, all these things happen. And this happens even in, with young children. And so as epinephrine circulates, the heart beats faster, the blood rushes to the muscles, and this response results in increased heart rate and blood pressure. So this is what's going on in the body when there's this dangerous threat. And so so when this threat is ongoing and all of these internal activities are going on, it impacts the brain's ability to develop appropriately. And so these alarm messages may be going off constantly for young kids that are in chronic stressful situations or experiencing traumatic stress over and over again. And so that fight, flight, or freeze response is just constantly going off for them. And they never know when they might be in that situation. So they respond in ways that they think is dangerous when it may not be, because of the ways that they've experienced life very early on, even in utero. So even saying that, so some children are exposed to crises, right? They're exposed to these traumas. Natural disasters can be that, community violence, abuse, neglect, we've talked about, even separation or death of loved ones, and you can probably think of others, domestic violence. Many young children experience the more common stresses, right? That can be stressful for them, like harassment from a sibling or rejection, adjusting to multiple caregivers that might go on. And these events can cause young children to feel vulnerable, worried, fearful, sad. And so community members, right? Parents, early childhood educators, pediatricians, and other adults, foster parents, coaches in that do young kid work, um, really can keep children safe by helping to prevent this stress and trauma, but also keeping in mind that that could be what's going on for them. So to build this resilience, these are the things that we want them to know. And so we can't always prevent these things from happening, but we can promote resilience. We can help these kids understand that they're safe, that they're lovable in their relationship, at least with you, that they're capable, and that they want to find meaning in things that have happened to them. So these are the things we try and build up in kids that could have experienced something really negative and scary in their world. This will help them to be resilient and build the skills that we want them to, that may or may not require them to also be in therapy, or could and will work on these kinds of things together. So this resilience helps children and adults overcome adversity with courage, skills, and faith in themselves. That's something that I can get through this with support of who takes good care of me and loves me. So let's take a look at this. I've got two videos back to back because one talks about infants and babies, and the other one talks a little bit more about toddlers and preschoolers. So hopefully you can hear these well. They both kind of start out the same way because they're presenting who they came from. So I'm going to go ahead and start this, and this will talk a little bit more about trauma's impact on development.
I'm Eddie Bocanegra.
And I'm Catherine Bocanegra.
We work in anti-violence programs throughout the city that addresses root causes of violence.
And we have seen what trauma can do to children as they are growing up. That's why we're excited to be spokespersons for Mobile, a new addition to the Stories for Children That Grown-Ups Can Watch series. As parents, and in our work to help children and families who have been exposed to trauma and violence, we have seen how these animated films, helpful video segments, and printed materials can make a difference.
If you are new to the Stories Project, you'll discover they are innovative materials that identify and highlight warning signs from childhood exposure to trauma and violence. They are created for you, parents, caregivers, and service providers.
This new Stories project, titled Mobile, is about how conflict in the home or in community affects or impacts infants.
We invite you to watch the animated film. Comments from national and local experts, service providers, and parents perhaps just like you.
Some people are surprised to learn that infants are aware of agitation and upsetting behavior around them, but in fact, babies are every bit as aware as young children and adults. They just respond in subtle ways that we might not be familiar with.
The DVD, storybook, and frequently asked questions brochure provides valuable information, tips, and local programs to help everyone, especially new parents, to understand their baby and the best ways to provide nurturing care.
There's a place where smiles and laughter can begin to happen on children's faces, even though they've seen some really scary things at home or in their community. It's here, in stories and information that can help even a baby start to heal. And it comes from programs helping children and families right in your neighborhood. Stories for children that grown-ups can watch.
A mobile hung over the baby's crib. It played music, looked at the baby, and learned things. Some of the things it learned, the baby's caregivers didn't know.
What's that pop can doing there? I said, what's that pop can doing there?
I'm not deaf.
Well?
I don't know. I didn't finish it.
You don't ever finish anything, do you? Doing the dishes or cleaning up? You don't even shut the kitchen drawers. I said, do you?
Turn the radio down. Would you just leave me alone? Hey, look what you did.
Leave you alone? Leave you alone? You bet I will.
Later, when the caregivers were able to pick up the pieces, the mobile began to talk.
Your baby hears you.
The loud noises scare her.
They hurt her. Fighting hurts her. Hurts her.
She's just a baby, but she can hear you. Hear you. Hear you. She feels the hurting. Feels.
The couple listened to the mobile. Instead of throwing it away, they decided to patch it up. They tried to fix things at home. Turn down the volume. At the same time, they worked at treating each other better. Change is never easy. But when they put the mobile back, it was there to remind them to practice, practice, so they'd have a healthy child.
All right, so that was a little bit about babies and how they experience trauma, even though they're not maybe in the room with them. So the next one is from a similar series. Oops, I'm sorry. Okay, this is so this is a little bit, so that was about babies, perhaps a little more immobile, right? Not moving around much yet. This one focuses a little bit more on toddlers and preschoolers who may have been exposed to trauma and how that impacts them and what families and communities can do to recognize those impacts.
There's a place where smiles and laughter can begin to happen on children's faces, even though they've seen some really scary things at home or in their community. It's here, in stories and information that can help even a baby start to heal. And it comes from programs helping children and families right in your neighborhood. Stories for children that grown-ups can watch.
I'll never speak to you again.
What about Sunday?
What about Sunday?
You said we'd go.
No, I didn't.
Yes, you did.
No,
Why'd you do that?
didn't.
You're doing it
Julio
again.
and Maria didn't know their little girl had seen them arguing.
No, you are.
Where are you going?
Out.
Fine, go
All
ahead.
they knew
Lying.
Could you just stop?
was that she had turned into a clingy thing.
Is that you, Lolita?
Lolita didn't want to be a clingy thing,
I'm out
but she was so scared by what she'd seen and heard.
of here.
You're clinging, Lolita.
She had to hang on to something.
I'll never speak to you again. What about Sunday?
Why'd you do that? You're doing it again.
Lolita, what's making you so clingy?
She was too scared to talk. Too scared to be out of sight of Maria and Julio. It was a problem. At daycare.
Come join the boys and girls, Lolita.
At the playground.
Wanna swing?
Even when Granny came over.
Come here, Lolita.
She just couldn't relax and let go.
Lolita, is that you or some kind of bug?
Finally, someone had to do something.
Unhook Lolita. We've got to do something.
So they did. They rocked her in their arms. They sang her songs. They came to understand that their arguing had made her frightened and clingy, so they were more careful when they argued. They thought about her first because they loved her. They also made some changes in the way they lived. They came home when they said they would, did what they said they would do, so she could depend on them. It took a lot of patience. But little by little, things began looking better. Until one day...
Wow, Lolita!
There's my little girl.
Children often become clingy after they've seen or heard loud arguments between grown-ups they love. They may feel insecure, confused, and frightened. If your child's behavior worries you and you're not sure how to respond, it's okay to ask for help. Click on the Help Us Here.
Okay. So those just kind of talk a little bit about how trauma impacts our youngest children, and how just small tweaks can really help support the family to just recognize what might be stressful and how little changes can make a big difference. So as part of the Children's Mental Health Campaign, and I'm not sure when these were made, but these are in the handouts and the materials that the campaign provides for young children. So this is an example that we hand out for young children, and it talks a little bit, on one side about when I act in this way, I want you to know that, and then, just simple ways that you can help by doing these things. So this handout's on the campaign's website, and I encourage you to have it out if you're one of the many champions, because I think the most important thing that we can do as a community is let folks know that infants and young children do have mental health challenges and are impacted by trauma. So in addition to that one, there's also a guide to caregiving following a stressful event. Perhaps you've seen some of these, and how to take good care of yourself as the caregiver or the family member that has also been impacted by mental health. So we're grateful to the campaign for allowing us to participate in putting these materials out for all of you. So I'm going to talk a little bit more. Why do we talk about trauma with young kids? So when young children perceive their environment as threatening, they experience a range of stress related to their emotions and respond in ways that might negatively impact their ability to engage in relationships and learning new skills. They're really highly aware of what's going on around them. That's part of how their brain's developing. And so traumatic experience during this developmental period, like abuse, neglect, unresponsive caregiving, can really disrupt that brain architecture that we talked about earlier and affect their health and development. And so there's an estimate that we're made to withstand stress for about 20 minutes at a time. So when children who are dependent on adults to protect and not yet regulate their stress response on their own. So they need those adults and caregivers to be the ones to help them to regulate, because they don't know how to make sense of what's going on with them. And so under continuously stressful or frightening conditions, these stress chemicals that we talked about in the previous slide can be continuously produced and have a big impact on that developing brain. So the more responsive we are to frightening events can really be powerful mediators to that child's response. So even though they've been impacted by something, the more positive response they get from us and allowing them to talk about it in their way will really help them to heal and not necessarily have that lasting impact. The earlier we identify it, the more we can get these programs and practices in place for families that may not need a whole lot, but just the recognition that something happened, so we can help them through it. So most of you are probably aware with this. So what is trauma, right? So trauma is a scary, dangerous, or violent event that can happen to any or all members of a family. And trauma comes from an event or a series of events that cause family members to experience intense body and emotional stress reactions. And then these are the effects, right? Trauma affects each person in the family differently. And that's why there may be some that have a different reaction to that event than others in the household, including the young children. And however, it can impact all of these things: mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. So all of these things can be impacted in different ways depending on various factors from early childhood, relationships within the family. And so sometimes just how that family member is impacted by that stressful event can then impact the relationship and the child's development. Right? Okay, so we know that children who have been exposed to a traumatic event spend a great deal of energy responding to, coping with, and coming to terms with that event. So there's ways that you might see it in their play, in their regulation, in their sleep, in their eating patterns. And so because they're so focused on this event or the experience that their body's responding to, they don't master those age-appropriate developmental tasks. They may be lagging in their language development. They may not be grasping some of the concepts that we'd expect them to in the early childhood environment because they're so wired to be afraid of something that's going to happen, and because their body's just focusing on this survival mode. And so oftentimes the longer that traumatic stress that their experience goes untreated or unnoticed, they tend to get further and further away from those developmental trajectories and look like they are experiencing developmental delays. But if we address this trauma, often we can see that catch up. It doesn't have to be long lasting, although it can, if something, if there is a, more cognitive, impairment that could also be going on. Okay, so let's take a look at the prevalence numbers that are rather unfortunate, but because all of you care about this very much, we can help reduce this and most importantly, address it when we see it. Trauma is common, right? More than 2/3 of children reported at least one traumatic event by 16 years old. And exposure comes in multiple forms. And victimization is often common. And sometimes, they experience 5 or more types throughout their lifetime. And polyvictimization places youth at high risk for psychiatric impairment and delinquency. So we want to try and reduce that victimization, identify this early so it doesn't continue to occur. And, in addition to those prevalence rates, young kids, just by nature of their development, from birth to age 3 are at greatest risk of injury and often death. And according to the CDC, the leading cause of injury in childhood are motor vehicle crashes, suffocation, drowning, poisoning, fires, and falls. And the data from 2018-2019, babies under 1 year old and older teens were at the greatest risk of dying from these injuries. So these things happen to kids, right? And they can create significant trauma for them as they're developing. And so it's really important not only to monitor it, but to recognize how these things that will naturally occur impact them going forward, and what fears might come up for them. So community violence is very common. So 1 in 10 children, this is old data, it may have increased, under the age of 6 live in a major American city, report witnessing a shooting or stabbing. And our children in Baltimore City, perhaps are impacted by this more, because like it says in the inner city experiences for these young kids, and identifying them early and helping families, to work through this is really important. And often these kids in Head Start, unfortunately, for various reasons, are exposed to community violence for all the reasons that we know, including racism, and just the impacts and danger that occurs in these communities that we're working hard to get past. Domestic violence is another big trauma that children can be exposed to, and I think this one's often thought of as not impacting young kids in different ways, but as you could see in the both videos, the ways in which that impacts kids, just because they weren't in the room, we think they don't hear things going on. They often hear things more than we think they do. And often the younger the child is, the more they're impacted by it, and their understanding of their role and the protection and who is safe in their world is just dizzying, in their small heads. And in addition to the domestic violence, it's also more common in these families that child abuse occurs that can really involve these kids in unfortunate circumstances. So understanding what's going on in the family context is really, really important. Either it may not be currently happening, but perhaps happened in the past. So understanding what that was like, and who and what they were living with is really important. Okay, so here's this is another short video I wanted to share. This is from the In Brief series, and explains a little bit why significant deprivation can be harmful in the earliest years of life, and why effective interventions that we have are likely to pay significant dividends, really pay off in the longer term outcomes for their learning, their health, and really just taking care of this generation that could have been impacted by trauma. So we'll take a look at this video, and then we'll talk some more.
Everyone in a community has a vested interest in everyone else's children, because everyone else's children determine the next adult population that makes for a successful society. Built into our biology is the need to have responsive interactions with adults.
Neglect for children is when they don't get what the brain is expecting to get, what the child is expecting to get, what we are biologically prepared and waiting for, which is input from those around us.
It's this back and forth serve and return interaction that literally shapes the architecture of the brain.
Serve and return begins when a child looks at something or observes something, makes an utterance, and that represents the serve. And the return is when the parent notices the child doing these things and responds to the child.
Under conditions where serve and return is broken, you literally are pulling away what is the essential ingredient of the development of human brain architecture.
It was a really compelling series of experiments where they started by videotaping the mother and the baby engaging in cooing and smiling. And then they asked the mother to basically put on a blank face and not respond at all. When a baby is not attended to, that is a sign of danger to the baby biologically. So the stress systems become activated.
in a brain that is constantly bathed in stress hormones, not that's up and down, that comes with normal development. Certain key synapses, the connections between nerves, fail to form, and critical regions of the brain.
So neglect both fails to provide the stimulation that's needed to develop the basic architecture, and when it's at a certain level, is one of the most potent activators of the stress biology of a young child. So you get a double whammy.
Science points to 4 categories of this spectrum of neglect. The first category would be what's called occasional inattention, where children experience responsiveness most of the time, but occasionally adults don't respond. There's no harm in that, and in fact, there's probably some benefit.
A child can learn to self-soothe and explore the environment, and all of those opportunities build brain architecture.
The second category, scientists would call chronic understimulation, is where on a regular basis, children have less interaction with the adults around them than is needed for healthy development.
Those children typically, when provided with enriched learning opportunities and more typical levels of serve and return, will show catch-up.
The third category is what science would call severe neglect in a family where not only are there prolonged periods of inattention and lack of responsiveness, but often also associated with not being fed enough, not being bathed enough, not having basic needs met.
Neglect is a huge problem in the U.S. Children are much more likely to be neglected than they are to experience any other kind of maltreatment.
We see the child really being at risk for much more substantial kinds of deficits down the road that don't necessarily get easily fixed or ameliorated. This is where we really need to think about more complicated and often more intensive strategies to help undo those effects.
The fourth category, called severe neglect, generally found in institutional settings, is a result of children living in kind of warehoused type situation in orphanages.
And it doesn't have to even be as extreme as orphanages. It can be experiences that are regretfully occurring in many, many parts of our country.
Often institutional care in this country is under the euphemistic name of transitional care or temporary care or assessment facilities.
If you think about what institutional or residential care would look like for an infant, where there's somebody new coming onto the shift every 8 hours, it really alters the development of the child's brain architecture and other aspects of the child's development.
We have the potential to change children's developmental trajectories.
Interventions can apply to parents, to foster parents or adoptive parents, child care settings, Head Start settings, and other kinds of settings. And really, what they're about is attuning people to the serve and return process.
Neglecting young children is neglecting the foundations of a healthy next generation. The community pays a huge price later in terms of the problems of the next generation, whether it be educational achievement, economic productivity, good citizenship, the ability to parent the next generation. All of the things that have to do with a healthy, prosperous society.
Okay, all right, so let's keep, okay. So as we can see, there are lots of ways in which, children experience trauma. And it unfortunately happens quite a bit. And I hope you took away from that also that it doesn't have to have lasting impact, right? Some of these very simple ways of intervening can really be helpful and change the trajectory of their, social and emotional health. However, when they have experienced traumatic events, these are some of the things that you could see that maybe changes from the way they had been behaving, right? Clinginess, like in the clingy thing, new onset of separation fears, that's not in the normal, development where we see young kids happening, eating and sleeping disturbances, physical aches and pains without medical medical diagnosis, perseverative play, nightmares, triggered responses to things that could be reminders that we may not know are reminders, but seem to become a pattern around one particular thing that maybe hadn't been before. So these are the kinds of things that we might see in very young children that could be as a result of experiencing trauma. And so there's developmental indicators that can be linked to exposure to a traumatic event. They have a particularly difficult time adjusting to change and loss. They feel helpless, powerless, and unable to protect themselves, and haven't developed the skills to deal with these stressful situations. And they're really dependent on the protection and support of caregivers, community members, and are strongly affected by the reactions of the caregivers to these events, right? So they may lose or fall back in skills or behaviors that they had outgrown, or may show bodily symptoms due to not having the verbal skills necessary to express their emotions. And they might have new onset of fears that may or may not be related to the traumatic event. They could have new onset of aggression and all kinds of things that seem, without understanding their context, out of nowhere, and really a regression in their skills because of something that's happened to them. So babies and toddlers can experience fear as early as 6 months old, and like other stages of development, they have to use these capacities with all the supportive caregivers to offer to help them learn to cope with these fears. So these are normal fears of early childhood. So having these fears doesn't necessarily indicate that they've been through a traumatic event. However, for them, these can feel very scary. So there's the fear of pain begins at 6 months, right? They get a lot of vaccinations often at this time. It's very common both, between the 6 and 8 month period and 8 to 24, they have that fear of loss, separation anxiety. Going to childcare can be very difficult because they don't know that person's coming back. Between 18 months and 3 years old, they have this fear of losing love and approval, right? They by being bad, they feel like they're not going to be loved. So encouraging them to understand that even though you did something wrong, we still love you. So repeating these kinds of things during this age is really important. And then there's fear of body damage, right? So this is when they're potty training. So sometimes they can be very afraid of using the potty because they feel like they're losing a part of themselves, right? They don't understand that that's normal without us continuously talking about it. And then at age 3, also that fear of being bad and social approval that they're looking for. So if scary things have happened during these periods of normal fears, sometimes we see them lasting even longer. And perhaps if they're experiencing some of these things older and they had a traumatic event that happened during these periods, we might see that behavior repeating. So these are normal fears that children experience, and experiencing something traumatic during these times can kind of enhance that. However, right, so parents of infants and young children can provide help for babies to feel comforted, loved, accepted, and capable, right, to build up those resilience tools that we talked about earlier. So just these basic things can really help them to navigate through these fears or, scary things that have happened. Food, warmth, sensory pleasures, touching things, hugs, just having that attachment with someone else, the beauty of life, right? Pictures of nature, and just making meaning in our lives. So these things help us as adults and just all people to cope with fears. And so when there are scary things that have happened and we have that anxiety building up, these kinds of things can help us cope and feel more in the moment with what's happening. So when something frightening happens, babies feel the stress, right? So we've talked about this. And we know that what parents, caregivers, community members can be that protective shield. It's really important that we recognize those fear responses and be emotionally available, recognizing that aggression as a fear response, not a oppositional or hyperactive behavior, although it could be. And then helping parents to, that they need support and recognizing this and helping each other when these big feelings come up for young kids. So when the parents and caregivers can be protective and nurturing, the children can then learn to cope with these fears and memories. So there has to be kind of this parallel process. Someone's got to help take care of those parents so that they can take care of their children. Either the parents are getting their own help, or they've got family members or community members that are helping take care of them so they can be their best selves for their kids. All right, so we're going to get a little bit into this resilience piece. So the first relationship is you, right? Careers in healthcare and caregiving and working with young children are both rewarding and very stressful. So taking care of yourself as that parent, as that caregiver role is essential to this work, especially with young children, because these stories and the impacts can just touch us at the core and make us, have big feelings for lots of reasons. And because most of us, I would say the majority of humans care about, young children and babies and don't want to see them hurting. So having ways to take care of yourself within your communities, within your workplaces is really important when you're working with families with young children that have been impacted by traumatic events. So this is the ways in which these can impact your work. So traumatic content, just experience it, hearing about it. This is why I opened it up this way, can cause dysregulation within your body in ways you may not be, even consciously aware of. And so when these emotions are charged, your executive functioning, your ways of thinking becomes disengaged. You just kind of come offline and are not able to think clearly and function in the way that you typically do. And so this regulation is critical for, intervening, whether in a therapeutic way or, just in a basic human way when you might be triggered by this experience that you're being told about or learning about for this child. And so we want to intervene thoughtfully and recognize our own internal feelings when these come up and be able to tag someone else in, or at least recognize it for ourselves and use a coping skill. So when these kinds of feelings come up for us, yet another self-care for caregivers that the campaign, one of the handouts in the campaign. So self-care for caregivers and teachers in stressful times. So when these things, you notice yourself triggered, all of these different ways in which you can respond or take care of yourself in the amount of time you might have in that moment. So 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever it is, taking good care of yourself and using whatever way makes you most available for these families and young children is going to make you that much better and keep this trauma-informed, way of being with families the most impactful. So I've got one more video I want to share with you about mindfulness. It just talks about how we can use this most basically in our lives and work relationships. And then I think I will be almost finished.
You may have heard this word mindfulness. It's become something of a buzz phrase of late. I'm going to give you one simple, serviceable definition, which is this. Mindfulness is the ability to know what's happening in your head at any given moment without getting carried away by it. Imagine how useful this could be. Just as an example, you're driving down the road and somebody cuts you off in traffic. How do you normally react? I think most of us, we normally react by having a thought, which is, I'm pissed. And then what happens next? You immediately, habitually, reflexively inhabit that thought. You actually become pissed. There's no buffer between the stimulus and your reaction. With just a little bit of mindfulness, in that same situation, you might notice my chest is buzzing, my Ears are turning red. I'm having a starburst of self-righteous thoughts. I'm getting angry. But you don't necessarily have to act on it and chase that person down the road, screaming at them with your kids in the back of the car thinking you've gone nuts. Now, you might be thinking, don't I need to get angry sometimes? Aren't I justified? I would say yes, but probably not as much as you think. The proposition here is not that you should be rendered by mindfulness into some lifeless, non-judgmental blob. The proposition is that you should learn how to respond wisely to things that happen to you, rather than just reacting blindly. And that, my friends, is a superpower. How do you get it? The way to get it is through meditation. I believe that meditation and mindfulness are the next big public health revolution. In the 1940s, if you told somebody you were going running, they would have said, who's chasing you? But then what happened next? The scientists swooped in, they showed that physical exercise is really good for you, and now all of us do it, and if we don't, we feel guilty about it. And that's where I think we're headed with mindfulness and meditation. It's going to join the pantheon of no-brainers like brushing your teeth, eating well, and taking the meds your doctor prescribed for you. Let me just close by saying, mindfulness is not going to solve all of your problems. It's not going to render your life a nonstop parade of unicorns and rainbows. Nonetheless, this is a superpower, and one that is accessible by you immediately.
Okay, so trauma-informed care, keeping these things in mind in spaces, in almost all spaces, if you ask me. It realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands the potential paths to recovery, right? Every child who's experienced trauma does not have to become mentally ill and need therapy, but recognizing that it's, and realizing that it's there is really important. Recognizing the signs and symptoms that we've talked about in clients, families, staff, and others involved within the system are really important. And we want to respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into all the ways that we practice and seek to resist re-traumatization for these young kids and families. There's a few resources, the NCTSN, National Child Traumatic Stress Learning Center, TFCPT, all of these kinds of things. I think you'll have access to these, so I won't go through all of this. A few more resources on trauma and references for your reading pleasure. This is our team at the Center for Infant Studies Secure Starts Clinic, many of which contributed to this slide deck in various ways from their own presentations that we put together. And you can follow us if you're interested. We're on Facebook and Twitter. Haven't been using Twitter as much lately, as you can imagine. Facebook is pretty active. And this is me. Don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or comments. And looks like there's about 5 minutes left. I think Ronnie has a few other things to wrap us up with, but that is all I have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brijan. Such a powerful topic. We do have a couple moments, maybe for 1 or 2 questions, if any did come up during the presentation. And you can feel free to either unmute or you can post it in the chat and I can read it out for you. Someone did ask, where can we find these handouts, and will you be sending out the copy of the slides? We will send out the slides, and we will also get those handouts and send it out with the slides as well.
Mm-hmm. And I believe many of them are in the mental health campaign website. Many of them, if they're not, you can let me know and I can send them. I know they have been in the past years. I haven't dug in this time.
If there are no questions, we will just wrap here. We want to just thank you again, Brijan, and the University of Maryland School of Medicine for this wonderful presentation. I also want to just give a special thank you to all of you for joining us today. Like I mentioned, you will receive a follow-up email with the link to the recording and the other resources that we talked about, as well as a survey asking for your feedback so that we know how to just do a better job for next time. There will be another children's webinar May 15th at 11:30 to 12:30, and this will be hosted by Cross Learning Group. It'll be a discussion on the power of words and what to say to kids to boost motivation, engagement, and growth. On Thursday, April 24th at 6:30 p.m., we are going to be hosting a workshop in partnership with the Parents Place of Maryland on disability pride. And so this will include a presentation on what that term is, disability pride, and how to build self-advocacy skills and strategies for implementation. If you haven't already, we encourage all of you to sign up to be champions for the 2025 Children's Mental Health Matters campaign. You'll join a growing network of Marylanders advocating for the mental well-being of children in communities across the state. And then lastly, we look forward to working with you all to continue to support families and communities in Maryland. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at info@cmhm.mhamd.org. And again, that's info@cmhm.mhamd.org. Thank you all so much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.